If I seem a little quiet this morning, it's because I am utterly disgusted, utterly disgusted with the way the Boston Bruins continue to operate. Now, we talked about this last week. We've talked about it before. We knew the trade deadline was coming, and we knew Brad Marchand's name was out there to potentially be traded. So when I watched the news yesterday live on the NHL Network with the reports stating that Brad Marchand was likely to be traded, now, of course, the original rumor was he was going to Vegas. The rumor before that was he was going to Toronto. And then, of course, the ultimate rumor, which turned out to be true, was that he was going to the Florida Panthers. When I saw that news on the television, it didn't surprise me. It didn't surprise me. It was clear to me with the way the Bruins have played all year, ever since really Montgomery was fired. Fired's the word you want to use. Quit, resigned, parted ways, however you want to look at it.
However you want to look at it.
Ever since that decision was made, it was clear to me what avenue the Bruins were going to go in. Now, despite the fact that Don Sweeney and Cam Neely at the beginning of the year said this team currently assembled could win a Stanley Cup.
Woo.
With the $82.5 million you spent in the offseason to sign Elias Lindholm and Nikita Zadorov, which have not worked out, which I would liken it to the deals of when they traded for in the Tyler Seguin trade a couple of years ago, Louis Eriksson. He never amounted to anything. You know, just to sign guys, just to trade for guys just because they're names and just because they've had success, you know, in years prior with teams out west doesn't translate well here in Boston. Sometimes it does, but oftentimes it doesn't. And so when I saw the news about Marchand, it didn't surprise me. What did surprise me, Clay, and we'll talk about Brad Marchand and his success with the Boston Bruins and his mentality with the Bruins. He was a Boston Bruin,
Wow.
and he embodied everything that the Boston Bruins are and should be.
Grit.
Exactly right. Exactly right. 1,090 games, 422 goals, 554 assists. Of course, the Stanley Cup champion is in 2011, a four-time All-Star, 138 points in 157 playoff games. I know we got some folks in line. We'll get to the calls, so hang on. What disgusted me the most was the return that Don Sweeney brought in for Brad Marchand. You're not trading Brad Marchand, your captain of the team, who's been with you from the beginning. And without Brad Marchand on the Boston Bruins right now, Clay, and without David Pastrnak, this team would be in the bottom of the, not just the Eastern Conference, but the entire league. And the best you can do is bring in a second-round conditional pick?
Yeah.
And don't get me started because he was injured. I don't want to hear that since he's week to week. I wouldn't be surprised, knowing who Brad Marchand is, if he starts and the Panthers are at the TD Garden on Tuesday night, would not be surprised if Brad Marchand takes the ice to play for the Florida Panthers, because that's the type of player he is. And you know he wants to play in front of the Bruins' hometown crowd.
Yes.
I don't want to hear that he was injured. You just traded your captain with all the success he's had. Just won Canada. Without him, I don't know if Canada would win a Four Nations.
No.
Okay? And the best you can do, Don Sweeney, is bring in a second-round pick when you got more for trading Charlie Coyle and Brandon Carlo and Justin Brazeau, but you trade your captain? And don't worry, though. The second-round conditional pick is, well, if Florida wins the first two rounds of the Stanley Cup playoff and Marchand plays in 50% of the playoff games, that turns into a first-round pick. Give me a break. Give me a break. The way Don Sweeney has drafted in years prior has been an absolute disgrace and an absolute joke. And yes, the Bruins did need to acquire draft picks because of the horrible draft capital that the Bruins have assembled in the past couple of years. They picked, Clay, in the first three rounds in just 3 of the last 7 drafts. Second round only twice in the last 6 drafts. And yet we continue to sit here and talk about the Bruins, and we continue to see coaches being fired. Claude Julien, Bruce Cassidy, Jim Montgomery, and Joe Sacco is not going to be back as head coach. That is for sure.
No.
And yet we continue to see no accountability in the front office. Don Sweeney and Cam Neely continue to stand by. Peter Chiarelli, who I called for to be fired.
Why?
Well, if we look back, we're not going to get into that because there were several missteps in that. Trading Tyler Seguin was one of them. We look at that. Chiarelli wins as general manager, wins the Stanley Cup of the Bruins in 2011. 3 years later, he's gone. Mind you, they fired Chiarelli before they fired Claude Julien. And yet here we are with Don Sweeney and Cam Neely, who fumbled the Swayman contract negotiations throughout the offseason, fiddled around the entire offseason playing around with this, making comments, this and that.
Right. Instead of just going ahead and getting it done.
Instead of going and getting it done, and maybe, too, trying to sign Marchand to, listen, Brad Marchand's not, the last contract they signed him to is an 8-year deal. That's not happening. But if you want to have your captain, who you just named your captain, mind you, come back and be a Bruin for the rest of your life.
You could have got it done.
You could have gotten it done. And so this is the last time, Clay, on this program that I will speak about the Boston Bruins, make the playoffs or not, which they're not going to. I refuse to talk about and legitimize a team that continues to be so unserious in the way things are going. And you could say, well, there are defenders out there. I'm reading articles now. The Bruins did very well. They did very well at the trade deadline because they brought in draft capital. And listen, if the goal is a retool, that's fine. That's fine. And if these picks are going to amount to anything, we'll see. But the Bruins cannot afford to wait around here. You just signed David Pastrnak to a huge extension. You just signed Jeremy Swayman to huge money. You have Morgan Geekie, who has been surprisingly strong this year. You have talent to assemble a good team, but I don't believe the Bruins can get to the next step until there is a change in front office, and I would say change in ownership.
I would say change in ownership because these guys are hamstrung. And what happened to Peter Chiarelli? He actually tried to go out and make deals, but that's what got him fired.
I should never have traded Tyler Seguin, but
I think his hands.
But if the goal, Clay, okay, is to sign some players and to assemble a team that's good enough to make the playoffs, that's good enough to beat Toronto in 7 games, that's good enough to make to the second round, but nowhere near good enough to win the Stanley Cup, well, congratulations. Then that's what you're here for.
I submit to you, 1 championship in 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's awful hard to be that mediocre unless you want to be.
Right. So
these guys are, I agree with you. And let's take a caller.
Well, we don't have anyone on the line because they all were waiting for us to finish. So we encourage folks to call back. But sorry, it's a 2-man show here. We can't do it all, unfortunately. But I will say this: Don Sweeney deserves a huge amount of blame. Poor drafting, misses in free agency. The Bruins are probably going to snap their 8-year postseason streak this year at the end of the month here as the season ends.
They're not making the playoffs.